There is a city in Scripture that seems incapable of staying buried. Long after its kings died, its walls crumbled, and its people disappeared from the pages of history, its name continued to echo through the biblical story. Prophets warned about it. Exiles wept within it. Kings feared it. And when the Bible reached its final book, it returned once again as a symbol powerful enough to represent humanity at its most ambitious and most dangerous: Babylon. The name carries weight even for people who have never opened a Bible. It evokes wealth and corruption, greatness and judgment. It was powerful enough to conquer Jerusalem and carry God's people into exile. Yet Scripture speaks of its destruction with such certainty that its downfall appears inevitable long before it arrives. How did Babylon rise to such heights? What transformed it from a city on a plain into the empire that humbled nations? Why did it become one of the most feared names in the biblical world? And how did the greatest kingdom of its age collapse in a single night? The answers begin long before Babylon ruled an empire. They begin with humanity itself. The first time Scripture introduces the spirit that would later define Babylon, there is no king seated upon a throne and no army marching beneath banners. Instead, there are families settling on a plain after generations of movement and multiplication. The flood had passed. The descendants of Noah had spread across the earth. God's instruction had been clear. Humanity was to fill the earth, steward it, and continue outward. Instead, people gathered. Genesis places them in the land of Shinar, a broad plain shaped by rivers and open skies. It was the kind of place where communities could grow, where travelers could become neighbors, and where shared ambition could quickly become collective confidence. Brick makers fired clay beneath the heat of the sun. Builders organized labor. Leaders imagined futures larger than anything previous generations had attempted. Then Scripture reveals what they were saying to one another. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. At first glance, it sounds like construction, but the deeper issue was not architecture, it was autonomy. Let us make us a name. Let us secure our future.
The problem was never the tower itself. The problem was humanity attempting to establish significance without dependence upon the one who had given them life in the first place. What would it have felt like to stand there and watch it unfold? Children running between stacks of bricks. Families convinced they were building security for generations yet unborn. Leaders believing unity itself guaranteed success. The excitement of participating in something larger than oneself. From the ground, it probably looked magnificent. From heaven, it looked different. God came down to see the city and the tower. Languages were confused. Communication fractured. The people scattered across the earth. The first great attempt to build permanence apart from God ended not in triumph, but in division. Scripture called that place Babel, and the pattern never truly disappeared. Centuries passed. Generations rose and fell. Kingdoms emerged and vanished. Then Babylon returned, not merely as an idea, but as an empire. By the time Babylon entered the story of Judah, it had become a force capable of reshaping the lives of entire nations. Its reach extended far beyond its capital. Kings adjusted their decisions around its movements. Smaller kingdoms learned to fear the sound of approaching Babylonian armies. For God's people, Babylon became deeply personal. Jerusalem was besieged. The temple was plundered. Sacred vessels dedicated to the worship of God were carried away. Princes, craftsmen, officials, and ordinary families found themselves uprooted from everything familiar and transported into a foreign world. Exile was more than relocation. It was grief. It meant waking each morning surrounded by unfamiliar customs and unfamiliar voices, while carrying memories of Jerusalem left behind. Psalm 137 preserves that sorrow. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. Psalm 137, verse 1. Imagine the scene. Families gathered beside waterways after long days of labor. Parents trying to explain Jerusalem to children growing up far from its gates. Songs once sung in celebration, now carrying the ache of absence. Captors requesting music from people whose hearts were still broken. How do you worship faithfully in a place that celebrates everything your faith resists? How do you remember who you are when an empire is trying to reshape your identity? Babylon forced those questions on an entire generation. Yet even there, God had not abandoned his people. Among those taken into Babylon was a young man named Daniel. He arrived as an exile. He would eventually stand before kings. And through Daniel, Scripture allows us to witness Babylon at its height of confidence.
Because no ruler embodied Babylon's greatness more completely than Nebuchadnezzar. Under his authority, Babylon projected strength in every direction. Administrators managed affairs across vast territories. Officials carried out royal decrees. Soldiers secured imperial interests. Wealth flowed through systems designed to sustain power. To ordinary people living in those days, Babylon likely appeared permanent, the sort of kingdom people assume future generations will simply inherit forever. Then, Scripture brings us onto a palace roof. Nebuchadnezzar looked upon everything he believed he had secured and said, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" The statement reveals more than pride. It reveals the illusion at the heart of every empire. The belief that success guarantees permanence. The assumption is that achievement eliminates vulnerability. The confidence that what has been built by human strength cannot be undone. Yet before those words were spoken, God had already warned him. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a great tree reaching towards heaven, visible across the earth, sheltering creatures beneath its branches and providing sustenance to many. Then came the command to cut it down. Daniel interpreted the dream. The king himself was the tree. He would be brought low until he learned a lesson Babylon could never teach, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Daniel urged him toward mercy and righteousness. Then 12 months passed. Nothing happened. A year can be a dangerous thing, long enough to mistake delayed judgment for canceled judgment, long enough to believe warnings no longer apply, long enough for pride to regain its footing. Then came the rooftop. Then came the declaration. Then came the interruption. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee." The transformation was immediate. The king who commanded armies lost mastery over himself. He was driven from human society. He ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven. His hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws.
The ruler who once looked untouchable discovered that human greatness has boundaries. Even kings breathe borrowed breath. Then, after years had passed, his understanding returned. Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes towards heaven, and Scripture records the final words attributed to Babylon's greatest king. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. The man who once celebrated himself ended by acknowledging a throne greater than his own. Babylon remained powerful. Its systems continued functioning. Its influence persisted. But beneath the appearance of stability, its final chapter had already begun. Because the rise of Babylon had never guaranteed its permanence, and the night of its fall was approaching.
Empires rarely imagine their endings. People living inside them almost never do. Merchants still open their shops. Officials still prepare reports. Families still gather around evening meals. Musicians still play at celebrations. Children still laugh in courtyards. Life develops its own rhythm, even beneath kingdoms that Scripture has already declared temporary. Babylon was no different. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire continued. The machinery of government still turned. Orders were still issued. Wealth still flowed through the kingdom. To ordinary people, the future may have seemed secure. Then came Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 5 brings us into one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Scripture. It does not begin on a battlefield or at the city gates. There are no armies gathering outside the walls. No desperate speeches from military commanders. It begins with a feast. Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords. The atmosphere was likely of celebration and confidence. Wine flowed freely. Nobles reclined around tables. Conversations filled the hall. Music echoed through chambers designed to display royal magnificence. No one in that room expected history to end before the night was over. Then Belshazzar made a decision. He ordered that the vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought into the banquet hall. These were not ordinary cups. They had once belonged to the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar had carried them away from Jerusalem. Generations had passed since then, but their origin remained known. Belshazzar knew exactly what they were. Scripture tells us that the king, his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank from them while praising gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. This was more than a celebration. It was defiance. The sacred had become entertainment. The memory of Jerusalem had become a joke beneath chandeliers and laughter. What do you think people in that room made of it? Did anyone hesitate? Did anyone remember the stories of Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation? Did anyone wonder whether some lines should never be crossed? Scripture gives no answers. It simply moves the story forward. Then the fingers appeared. Not a hand, fingers, writing upon the plaster of the wall opposite the lampstand where everyone could see. One moment there was feasting, the next there was silence. The confidence of the room evaporated instantly. Daniel records Belshazzar's reaction with remarkable detail. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Daniel chapter 5, verse 6. The man who commanded the feast suddenly could not command himself. He summoned Babylon's wise men. Rewards were offered. Power was promised. Whoever could read the writing would become the third ruler in the kingdom. Yet none of them could explain what stood before them. Then the queen entered. She remembered something Belshazzar had forgotten. There was a man in the kingdom who had stood before another king in another crisis. A man in whom wisdom had once been recognized. A man named Daniel.
Daniel was brought before Belshazzar. The king repeated his promises of honor and authority. Daniel answered with unusual boldness. Before interpreting a single word, he reminded Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar. He recalled the greatness God had given him. He recalled the pride that consumed him. He recalled the judgment that followed. Then Daniel turned from history to confrontation. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. Daniel 5:22. Those words cut deeper than the writing itself. You knew what happened before you. You knew pride had consequences. You knew kingdoms answer to a greater king. And still you lifted yourself against the Lord of heaven. Then Daniel interpreted the message written upon the wall. And this is the writing that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Daniel 5:25-28. Numbered, weighed, divided. 3 words, an entire empire summarized in a sentence. Belshazzar fulfilled his promise. Daniel was clothed in purple and proclaimed the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Scripture delivers one of its most abrupt conclusions. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Daniel 5:30. No dramatic campaign, no prolonged resistance, no final speech. A feast, a warning, a verdict, an ending. The empire that once carried Jerusalem into exile discovered that its own days had been counted as carefully as everyone else's. Long before Belshazzar raised those sacred vessels to his lips, however, Babylon's downfall had already been spoken. The prophets did not describe Babylon's destruction as a possibility. They described it as an appointment. Isaiah declared, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." Isaiah 13:19. Jeremiah described Babylon in language both beautiful and devastating. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Jeremiah 51:7. Babylon intoxicated nations with power, wealth, influence, and confidence. Yet even golden cups can be emptied. Only a verse later, Jeremiah declared, "Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her. Take balm for her pain, if so be she may be healed." Suddenly, the word feels appropriate because empires often appear strongest immediately before they collapse.
Isaiah also recorded something extraordinary. He named the ruler connected with Jerusalem's restoration. That saith of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure," even saying to Jerusalem, "Thou shalt be built," and to the temple, "Thy foundation shall be laid." Isaiah 44:28. Babylon's story did not end with exile. Captives returned. Jerusalem would rise again. The God who allowed judgment also remembered mercy. For the exiles beside Babylon's rivers, those promises mattered deeply. Can you imagine hearing those words while living far from home, raising children in a foreign land, wondering whether Jerusalem would ever be more than memory, trying to remain faithful while surrounded by reminders of defeat? Babylon had taken much from them. It had not taken everything. Hope survived exile. The remarkable thing is that Babylon refused to disappear entirely from Scripture, even after its power ended. By the time the Bible reached its final book, Babylon had become something larger than geography. Its name carried accumulated meaning, human pride, the seduction of power, the illusion of permanence, the tendency to trust systems more than God, the desire to build identities independent of the one who gave humanity life. The same impulse that gathered people upon the Plain of Shinar continued resurfacing throughout history. Revelation captured that reality with haunting familiarity. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, "Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and cage of every unclean and hateful bird." Revelation 18:2. The name still carried weight, because Babylon had always been more than bricks and walls. It represented what humanity repeatedly becomes when ambition outruns humility. The story began with people saying, "Let us make us a name." It ended with kings discovering that names built upon pride eventually fade. Perhaps that is why Babylon still unsettles readers thousands of years later, because its story feels uncomfortably familiar. How often do people seek security in achievements that cannot last? How often do societies assume success guarantees permanence? How often do individuals build identities upon accomplishments while neglecting the one who gave them breath? Babylon forces difficult questions, because Babylon reveals enduring tendencies of the human heart. Yet its story also offers reassurance. No empire escapes accountability. No act of faithfulness is forgotten. No exile lasts forever. The God who scattered people upon the Plain of Shinar remained present beside the rivers of Babylon. The God who humbled Nebuchadnezzar heard the songs of grieving captives. The God who numbered Belshazzar's kingdom also remembered promises made to his people.
The city that once appeared indestructible eventually became dust. Its feasts ended. Its kings died. Its glory faded. But the scriptures that recorded its rise and fall continue to be read. And perhaps that is the final surprise hidden within Babylon's story. The people who built towers to make their name endure are remembered today largely because of the God they tried to live without. The city that sought permanence discovered its own fragility. The kingdom that carried others into exile could not escape its appointed end. And the books that preserve its story still invite every generation to look again at the biblical world and discover that beneath the rise and fall of empires lies a larger reality. Kings come and go. Cities rise and crumble. Human ambition reaches upward again and again. But above every throne stands a kingdom that does not depend on walls, armies, wealth, or fear. And that story reaches far beyond Babylon. Because somewhere beyond exiles and empires, another layer of the biblical world still waits to be uncovered.